I never expected that a leaky roof would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when the roofer asked for a spotter and told me to stand close behind him. It sounds simple, I know. A mundane request born of necessity. But sometimes, the simplest things are the ones that shift the entire axis of your world. Let me take you back. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28, working as a freelance graphic designer from a small house I'd bought a couple of years prior. It was my sanctuary, a quiet bubble of organized solitude. My days followed a predictable, comforting rhythm. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk for 8 to 10 hours moving pixels around. Make dinner, watch something, sleep. It was a good life, a stable life. But if I was being honest with myself, it was also a lonely one. Not a loud, aching loneliness, but a quiet, creeping kind, like ivy growing over a wall you've stopped paying attention to. The house was my biggest project. An old bungalow with good bones, but a long list of things that needed attention. The most urgent of which, as I discovered one rainy Tuesday morning, was the roof. A dark, ugly stain had appeared on the ceiling of my guest room, a slow, methodical drip echoing in a bucket I'd placed underneath it. It was a sound that seemed to mock the quiet order of my life. So, I did what any responsible homeowner does. I got 3 quotes, went with the company that had the best reviews, and signed a contract. A week later, a truck pulled up, and a team of 3 men started setting up ladders and scaffolding. From my office window, which overlooked the front yard, I watched them work. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their conversation a low murmur of professional shorthand I couldn't decipher. And that's when I first saw him. His name, I would later learn, was Caleb. He was the crew leader. He didn't look like the other guys, who were either much older and weathered or much younger and still gangly. Caleb was probably in his early 30s, with a solid, compact build that spoke of years of physical labor. He had dark hair, cut short, and a way of moving that was utterly confident and economical. Every gesture had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. I found myself watching him more than I should have. It was a passive, harmless kind of observation. I'd be staring at a color palette on my screen, and my eyes would drift to the window, finding him effortlessly as he navigated the steep pitch of my roof. He had a focus that was magnetic. The sun would beat down, and he'd pull off his shirt, his back and shoulders a landscape of muscle that was both beautiful and completely intimidating. He was, in the clinical way I assessed such things, objectively attractive. The kind of man you see on the cover of a hardware store flyer. Rugged, capable. The kind of man who almost certainly had a pretty girlfriend waiting for him at home, who liked beer and football and had never once in his life felt the quiet, anxious flutter of uncertainty I lived with every day. He was from a different world than mine. So I watched, and I cataloged his existence as something separate, something to be observed from behind the safety of glass, and then I would turn back to my work. The days passed like this. I'd make my coffee, and the sound of their work would be the soundtrack to my morning. The rhythmic pop of the nail gun, the scrape of old shingles being removed, the low rumble of their voices. I made a point of bringing them out a cooler of cold water each afternoon, a gesture of polite homeowner courtesy. I'd get a chorus of, "Thanks, man," and "Appreciate it," but Caleb would just nod, a small, focused smile on his face, his eyes already back on the task at hand. Our interactions were minimal, transactional. He was the capable professional, and I was the client. I told myself that was all it was. A simple, detached appreciation for a good-looking man doing his job. It was like admiring a statue in a museum. You can appreciate the artistry, but you don't expect it to step off the pedestal and talk to you. You certainly don't imagine what it would feel like to touch it. But as the week wore on, I found the lines of that detachment beginning to blur, just a little. There was a moment, on the 3rd day, when a gust of wind caught a stack of his drawings, schematics for the roof, I guess, and sent them scattering across my lawn. I saw it happen from my window. Before I could even think, I was out the door, chasing the rogue pieces of paper across the grass. He jumped down from the low scaffolding, and we both converged on the last sheet as it pinned itself against my rose bushes. Our hands brushed as we both reached for it. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little breathless. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. His eyes were a startlingly clear shade of hazel, flecked with green and gold. Up close, I could see the lines of exhaustion around them, the faint smudge of tar on his cheek. "You're quick." "Years of chasing deadlines," I said, trying for a joke. It fell a little flat, but he smiled. A real smile this time, not just a polite nod. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger, less severe. "Lucas, right?" he asked, glancing at the name on the work order he was holding. I nodded. "And you're Caleb." I knew his name from the initial consultation, but saying it out loud felt different, more personal. "That's me," he said. The moment lingered for a beat too long. The air felt charged, filled with an unspoken something I couldn't name. Then, one of the other guys called his name, and the spell was broken. He gave me a final nod, gathered his papers, and went back to work. I went back inside, my heart hammering against my ribs for a reason I refused to fully acknowledge. That brief touch, that fleeting smile, it was nothing. And yet, it felt like everything. I learned that life rarely gives you a dramatic, orchestral swell to announce a turning point. Sometimes, it's just the anxious tap of a weatherman on a screen, pointing to a swirling mass of color that's heading your way. That's how the inciting incident of my story began. Not with a bang, but with a weather forecast. It was Thursday afternoon, and the project was supposed to be wrapped up by Friday evening. But the forecast had changed dramatically. A massive storm system, the kind that usually stayed out at sea, had taken a sharp turn and was now barreling toward us. They were predicting torrential rain and high winds, starting Saturday morning. For a house with a half-finished roof, that was a death sentence. I was in the kitchen when Caleb knocked on my back door. He'd taken off his dusty work boots and was standing on my porch in his socks, a sign of respect that I found oddly endearing. He looked worried, his brow furrowed as he held up his phone to show me the weather app. "Hey, Lucas," he started, his tone serious. "We've got a problem. This storm. If we don't get the main section sealed and waterproofed by tomorrow night, you're going to have a swimming pool in your attic." My stomach dropped. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "What do we need to do?" "We need to work late," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Tonight and tomorrow. We need to beat this thing. But I'm a man down. Frank's kid got sick. He had to leave an hour ago. And there's this one section," he trailed off, pointing up toward the steepest part of the roof, a tricky gable right above my office window. "It's a two-man job. One guy on the roof, one on the ground. For safety." He looked genuinely stressed, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his armor of unwavering competence. He wasn't just a roofer. He was a small business owner, and his reputation was on the line. I felt a surprising surge of protectiveness, a desire to ease the worry from his face. "What do you need?" I asked. He hesitated, looking from me to the roof and back again. He was clearly weighing his options, and I could tell he hated what he was about to ask. "This is a long shot, and you have every right to say no. It's completely unprofessional of me to even ask, but I'm in a real bind." He took a breath. "I need a spotter. Just for an hour, maybe two, to get this last crucial section done before we lose the light." My mind raced. Me? A spotter? I once struggled for 20 minutes to assemble an IKEA bookshelf. My expertise with tools was limited to knowing the difference between a hammer and a screwdriver, and even that was shaky on a bad day. I was the least qualified person on the planet for this job. "What does a spotter do?" I asked, my voice betraying my ignorance. "Honestly, not much," he admitted. "You just stand on the ground. I'll be on the ladder, then on the roof. You watch my footing from a different angle. You make sure the ladder is secure. You hand me a tool if I need one. Mostly you just pay attention. It's a safety protocol. The company requires it for sections over a certain pitch." He looked at me, his hazel eyes pleading. "I can knock a bit off the final bill for your trouble. I really need to get this done." Every cautious, self-protective instinct in my body screamed at me to say no. It was his job, his problem. I was the client. There were boundaries. But then I looked at the worry etched on his face, and I thought about the quiet, empty evening I had planned, and a different voice took over. It was a voice that craved a disruption to my routine, a voice that was undeniably curious to see this man outside the strict confines of our professional relationship. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Yeah, I can do that." The relief that washed over his face was palpable. It was like watching the sun come out from behind a cloud. "Really? Man, thank you. You have no idea. You're saving me right now, Lucas." And just like that, the boundary between us, the one made of client and contractor, of observer and observed, dissolved. I was no longer just the guy behind the window. I was about to become part of the work, stepping out of my quiet, ordered world and into his. I had no idea then what that simple yes would set in motion. I just knew that for the first time in a long time, my evening was not going to be predictable. We started just as the afternoon began to fade into the golden light of early evening. The air grew cooler, and the scent of cut grass and warm asphalt hung in the air. The remaining crew member, a quiet guy named Marco, was tasked with cleanup, so it was just Caleb and me at the base of the tall extension ladder propped against the difficult gable. "All right," Caleb said, turning to me. He handed me a pair of work gloves that were far too big for my hands. "Rule number 1. Just keep your eyes on me and the ladder. That's your whole world for the next hour." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and excitement. This was his world, and he was letting me in. He explained what he was going to be doing in simple terms, pointing out the specific flashing he needed to install and the waterproofing membrane he had to lay down before the shingles could go on. He spoke with a quiet passion, the way I probably did when talking about typography or color theory. It was fascinating to see this side of him, the teacher, the expert. "Ready?" he asked. I gave him a thumbs up, feeling slightly ridiculous in my oversized gloves. He started up the ladder, his movements fluid and sure. I stood at the base, my hands resting lightly on the aluminum rails, as if my touch could somehow will it to be more stable. My job, for the moment, was to simply watch. And I did. I watched the way his muscles tensed and relaxed as he climbed, the confident set of his shoulders, the intense focus in his profile as he surveyed his work. The initial awkwardness between us began to melt away, replaced by a comfortable, shared purpose. He'd call down for a tool, and I'd clip it onto the rope pulley he'd set up. We developed a rhythm. His work was a kind of dance, and I was his partner on the ground. After a while, the silence was broken by light-hearted banter. He teased me about my pristine sneakers. "Don't think those have ever seen a patch of dirt before," he called down, a grin in his voice. "They're for indoor sports," I retorted, like running to the fridge and avoiding social interaction. To my surprise, he let out a genuine laugh. It was a deep, warm sound that echoed in the quiet evening. "I hear you," he said. "Sometimes I think I talk to shingles more than I talk to people." It was a small admission, but it felt significant. It was the first crack in the facade of the rugged, self-assured roofer. A hint of a shared loneliness, maybe? Or perhaps I was just projecting. But it made him seem more real, more approachable. Then came the moment that shifted things more profoundly. He was perched on the roof's edge, carefully maneuvering a large, awkward piece of metal flashing into place. It was a precarious position, and I found myself holding my breath. "This part always gets to me," he said, his voice a little tight. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he was talking to me. "Why is that?" I asked, my voice low. "My old man," he said, his focus never leaving his hands. He was a roofer his whole life. Took a bad fall from a spot just like this when I was a kid. Broke his leg in 3 places. Never walked right again. He paused, carefully hammering a nail into place. "I think about it every time I'm on a steep pitch. It's good, though. Keeps you from getting complacent." My heart ached for him. It was such a vulnerable, unguarded revelation. He wasn't just a capable tradesman. He was a son carrying the weight of his father's history, a man who felt fear but pushed through it every single day. My perception of him expanded in that moment, adding layers of depth and history I'd never imagined. He was no longer just a handsome stranger. He was Caleb. He finished the section and began his descent. He moved more slowly now, the physical and mental toll of the day evident in his posture. When his feet hit the second-to-last rung of the ladder, he paused and looked down at me. The evening sun cast a warm glow on his face, illuminating the dust and sweat on his skin. "Thanks again, Lucas," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Couldn't have done that without you." He stepped off the ladder onto the grass. He was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of gratitude. It was a simple touch, but it sent a jolt through me. His hand was calloused and strong, and it rested on my shoulder for just a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. His thumb pressed lightly against my collarbone. In that small, significant moment, the air crackled. Our eyes met. and the world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between us. I could see the fatigue in his eyes, but I could also see something else, something questioning, something uncertain. It was a silent conversation, a question asked and unanswered. Then he dropped his hand, the spell broken, and turned to start packing his tools. My shoulder still burned where he had touched me. The turning point of a story, much like the turning point in a life, is rarely a single, explosive event. It's more often a cascade of small moments that build to a critical mass, a point of no return. For us, it began with that lingering touch and ended with the slip of a ladder. We had lost the light completely by then. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Marco had already left for the day. A single, powerful work light Caleb had set up cast long, dancing shadows across the yard. We were packing up the last of the tools in a shared, weary silence. The earlier ease between us had been replaced by a new, charged awareness. I was acutely conscious of his proximity, of the way his arm brushed mine as we both reached for a hammer. "Just one last check," he said, his voice sounding rough with fatigue. He gestured toward the ladder, still propped against the house. "Need to make sure that final seal is tight before the dew sets in." He walked over to the ladder, and I followed instinctively. The grass beneath it was damp now, darker than the surrounding lawn. He put a foot on the first rung and then paused, turning back to me. "Hey, can you just hold the base for me? It's a little slick here. Just steady it." "Of course," I said, moving into position. I gripped the cold aluminum rails, my feet planted firmly on the ground. I was standing directly behind the ladder, my body aligned with his. He started to climb, and I watched his boots ascend, rung by rung. He was only about halfway up, maybe 10 feet off the ground, when it happened. There was a sickening scraping sound of metal on wet earth. The base of the ladder, despite my grip, slid a few inches to the left. It wasn't a huge slip, but it was enough to throw him off balance. He let out a sharp grunt of surprise, his body lurching sideways. Adrenaline, pure and potent, shot through my veins. I didn't think, I just reacted. I threw my entire body weight against the ladder, bracing it with my shoulder and chest, my cheek pressed hard against the gritty metal of a rung. My hands, which had been holding the sides, were now gripping a rung in front of me, my knuckles white. Caleb scrambled down instantly, his feet finding the rungs with frantic speed. A moment later, he was on the ground, his chest heaving. He stumbled forward from the momentum, and before I could move back, he was right there. His body collided with mine, his chest pressing against my own as he fought to regain his balance. My hands were still on the ladder, trapping us together. We were chest to chest, tangled up in a mess of adrenaline and surprise. His heart was hammering against my own, a frantic, shared rhythm. I could feel his ragged breaths against my temple. The air was thick with the scent of his sweat, of sawdust, and something else, something uniquely him. Time seemed to stretch and warp. We stayed like that for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. He was pressed against me, his hands on my shoulders now, not in a friendly gesture, but for balance, for support. I was the only thing holding him steady. He slowly lifted his head, and his face was inches from mine. In the harsh, dramatic light of the work lamp, I could see every detail. The faint scar above his eyebrow, the dark stubble on his jaw, the wide, startled look in his hazel eyes. The world went silent. The chirping of crickets, the distant hum of traffic, it all faded away. There was only his breathing and mine. "Thanks," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Man, you really," he didn't finish the sentence. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my lips. And that's when it happened. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. But the small space between us vanished. He leaned in, and his lips brushed against mine. It wasn't a real kiss. It was lighter than that, more tentative. A ghost of a touch. It was hesitant, questioning, and filled with a universe of unspoken things. It was a spark in the dark, brief and electric, and it set my entire nervous system on fire. It lasted for only a second. Just as quickly as it happened, he pulled back. A look of shock, or maybe panic, crossed his face. He looked utterly horrified. He untangled himself from me, taking a clumsy step back, nearly tripping over a coil of rope. I'm sorry," he stammered, not looking at me. The ladder. Adrenaline. I don't know. He was fumbling for an explanation, for a way to undo what had just happened. He immediately became a whirlwind of activity, grabbing tools, shutting off the light, throwing things into the back of his truck with a clatter. He didn't speak to me again. He just worked, his movements jerky and frantic. I stood frozen in place, my body still buzzing from the contact. My lips tingled. I watched him, my mind a blank slate of shock and confusion. Had that really happened? Or had the adrenaline and the strange, intimate nature of the evening conspired to make me imagine it? When he was done, he practically threw himself into the driver's seat of his truck. He rolled down the window, but he kept his eyes fixed on the steering wheel. "We'll be here early tomorrow to finish up," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, all traces of the earlier warmth gone. "You don't need to. You know, we're good." And then he was gone, his taillights disappearing down my quiet street, leaving me alone in the dark, replaying that single, fleeting, earth-shattering moment over and over again. The aftermath was a special kind of torture. It was a silence so loud it was deafening. The next day, Friday, Caleb's truck was there when I woke up, but he was not. He had sent Marco and the other crew member, Frank, to finish the job. I watched from my window, my stomach in knots, as they expertly laid the final rows of shingles. There was no sign of Caleb. I spent the entire day in a fog of anxious analysis. My graphic design work sat untouched on my screen. I was a detective and a scientist, replaying the evidence of the previous night in a continuous loop in my mind. The slip of the ladder, our bodies pressed together, the look in his eyes, the ghost of that kiss. Every detail was scrutinized, turned over, and examined from a dozen different angles. Was it just the adrenaline, as he'd claimed? A moment of disorientation after a near fall? It was a plausible explanation, a perfectly logical reason for what had happened. It was the explanation a cautious, self-protective person like me should have clung to. It would have been easier to believe that, to dismiss it and move on. But my heart, that stubborn, hopeful traitor, refused to accept it. It fixated on the other details. The way his gaze had dropped to my lips. The hesitation before he leaned in. It hadn't felt like an accident. It had felt like a question. A question he had immediately regretted asking. His absence that day was the most damning evidence of all. If it had truly been a meaningless, adrenaline-fueled mistake, wouldn't he have shown up? Wouldn't he have made a joke about it, laughed it off, and moved on to prove how little it meant? To disappear completely. That suggested it meant something. It suggested he was scared. And that single thought was the ember of hope I fanned obsessively all day. Fear and hope waged a brutal war inside me. Hope would paint a picture of a future where that moment was the beginning of something real. It would imagine conversations, dates, a life where someone as strong and capable as Caleb could want someone as quiet and introspective as me. But then fear would storm in and tear that picture to shreds. It would whisper that I had misread everything, that I had made him so uncomfortable he couldn't even face me, that I had taken a moment of panic and twisted it into a romantic fantasy. I had taken his vulnerability and projected my own desperate loneliness onto it. Late in the afternoon, Marco knocked on my door. "All done," he said with a friendly smile. "Caleb said to tell you he's sending the final invoice over by email. Said it was a pleasure working with you." The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. The invoice. A digital, impersonal end to everything. I thanked Marco, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. I watched them pack up the last of their equipment, remove the scaffolding, and sweep my lawn clean of any debris. They were erasing all traces of their presence, all traces of him. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was empty. The roof above me was solid and secure, ready for the coming storm, but I felt more exposed and vulnerable than ever. I received the invoice in my email. As promised, there was a discount listed with the note. For homeowner assistance, it was so formal, so cold. I paid it immediately, typing in my credit card numbers with a sense of grim finality. It was over. The storm arrived on Saturday morning, just as predicted. The sky turned a bruised gray, and a torrential rain began to fall, lashing against my new, perfectly sealed roof. I should have felt relieved, satisfied. Instead, I just felt empty. I made coffee and sat by my office window, watching the rain run in sheets down the glass, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my disappointment. I had let that tiny ember of hope grow into a wildfire, and now I was left standing in the ashes. It was foolish, I told myself. It was always foolish to hope. 3 days went by. 3 days of rain, of quiet, and of me trying to force my life back into its old, predictable rhythm. I worked. I cooked. I watched movies. I tried to forget the feeling of his body pressed against mine, the whisper of his lips against my own. I was almost successful. I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it was a brief moment of madness that was best forgotten. And then, on Tuesday evening, my doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw him. It was Caleb. He wasn't in his work clothes. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked clean and impossibly nervous. He was holding a small, potted succulent, of all things. He looked up at my door, then down at the plant, then back at the door, as if gathering the courage to have ever rung the bell in the first place. I took a deep breath and opened the door. He looked startled, as if he hadn't actually expected me to answer. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. An awkward silence stretched between us. He thrust the succulent forward. This is for you," he said. Thank you for helping me the other night. And, for the whole not letting me fall and break my neck thing. You didn't have to do that," I said, taking the small pot from him. Our fingers brushed, and the same electric current from the other night shot up my arm. "I know," he said. I wanted to. He still wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Can I come in for a second? I need to say something." My mind was screaming at me to be careful, to protect myself. But I couldn't. I just nodded and stepped aside, holding the door open for him. He walked into my living room and stood awkwardly in the center of the rug, looking around at my space, at the books on my shelves, the art on my walls. I closed the door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I set the plant down on the coffee table and turned to face him. "What's up, Caleb?" He finally looked at me, his hazel eyes filled with a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. He took a deep breath, like a diver about to plunge into deep water. "Look," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I have been an idiot. The way I disappeared on Friday, the cold email. I'm so sorry, Lucas. It was cowardly. I just listened, not trusting myself to speak. The other night," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the yard, "when the ladder slipped. And afterward, I told you it was the adrenaline." That was a lie. He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "Okay, not a total lie. There was definitely adrenaline. But that's not why I kissed you." He said it. He said the word. Kissed. It was real. It wasn't something I had imagined. The validation of it was so overwhelming I felt lightheaded. "I wanted to," he said, his voice cracking slightly with vulnerability. "God, I've wanted to since that first day. I'd see you in the window, and I'd just lose my train of thought. I kept trying to think of a reason to talk to you that wasn't about roofing felt or drip edges." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out, nearly falling to my death was the best I could come up with." He finally met my gaze, and all the walls were down. All the pretense was gone. I was just seeing him, raw and uncertain. I've never felt that way about a guy before," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It scared the hell out of me. So I ran. And I have regretted it every single minute since." A profound sense of relief washed over me, so potent it felt like I could finally breathe again after days of holding my breath. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't horrified. He was just scared, just like me. And in that moment, I knew I had to be brave, too. "I'm glad you did," I said, my voice shaking just a little. "Kiss me, I mean. Not the running away part." A small, hopeful smile touched his lips. Yeah, I confirmed, a matching smile finding my own. For what it's worth, it scared the hell out of me, too. He closed the distance between us in 2 short steps. He reached up, his calloused hand cupping my cheek so gently, so tenderly, it made my knees feel weak. Can I try it again?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Without the adrenaline and the near-death experience this time. I didn't answer with words. I just leaned in and closed the small gap between us. And this time, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a ghost of a touch. It was a real kiss. It was confident and sure, but also gentle and searching. It was a confession and an answer all at once. It was the beginning of everything. That kiss wasn't an ending, it was a doorway. We stepped through it together, leaving our separate, solitary worlds behind and walking into a new one we were just beginning to build. The weeks that followed were a blur of discovery. We went on our first real date 2 days later. We went to a simple diner, sat in a corner booth, and talked for 3 hours. I learned about his family, about his dream of one day building custom furniture instead of fixing roofs. He learned about my work, about my passion for minimalist design, about the fact that I can't keep a plan alive to save my life. He laughed and promised to take care of the succulent he'd given me. There was an ease between us that felt both brand new and centuries old. Being with him was comfortable, like coming home to a place you didn't know you were searching for. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. He'd sometimes show up at my door after a long day of work, smelling of tar and sunshine, and I'd have a cold drink waiting for him. I'd show him the logos I was designing, and he'd give surprisingly insightful feedback, his eye for structure and balance just as sharp with fonts as it was with rooflines. We discovered our differences and the ways they complemented each other. He was the steady, physical presence that grounded my often anxious, cerebral energy. I was the quiet, stable port he could return to after a chaotic day battling the elements. He taught me how to properly use a drill. I introduced him to the joy of foreign films with subtitles. It was a beautiful, gentle unfolding. One evening, a month or so later, we were sitting on my back porch. It was a warm, clear night, and the stars were brilliant. Caleb's arm was around my shoulders, and my head was resting against his chest. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. We were looking up at the house, at the clean, perfect lines of the new roof against the dark sky. He pointed with his free hand. "See that spot? Right there on the gable." I smiled, knowing exactly which spot he meant. "Hard to forget. I drive by sometimes, on my way to other jobs," he confessed quietly. "And I look at that spot on your roof, and I can't believe how lucky I am that my ladder slipped." He tightened his arm around me. "Best clumsy moment of my life." "It wasn't a clumsy moment," I said, tilting my head back to look at him. "It was gravity. It was physics. It was the universe giving you a little push in the right direction." He grinned down at me and leaned in to kiss me. A slow, deep kiss filled with the comfort and certainty we had built in the weeks since our first, fumbling connection. In that moment, everything felt right. Perfectly, exquisitely right. I used to think that life was about building walls to keep yourself safe, about creating a routine so solid that nothing could shake it. But Caleb taught me that's not living. It's just existing. True living is about the moments that crack the foundation. It's about the unexpected storms that force you to look up and see what needs fixing. It's about having the courage to say yes when someone asks for your help and the vulnerability to let them get close. My life didn't change because of a leaky roof. It changed because for the first time, I was brave enough to step out into the rain.